I prepared remarks, so I'm not as ill-prepared as I may sound. I started off this morning in New York City at a book launch of our Believe Me book. And so I had to rush from New York City, get here, deal with a car that was iced in on a hill in Shutesbury, and then make myself get here in time and all of this. So I'm feeling a bit discombobulated, and I haven't had food since 6 o'clock this morning.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. So if I start chewing on your arm, Carrie,
I'll know why.
you'll know why. But I've been, to start off, I want to say, I've been looking at Margaret Sanger with intentionality since I started writing on African American women and abortion. And I started writing on African American women and abortion in the late 1980s. Excuse me. A woman named Stanley James invited me to the University of Wisconsin, a history of medicine conference, to give a talk about black women's activism in the reproductive rights movement. And then Stanley encouraged me to document my talk, because I'm an activist. We talk, we don't write normally. And so that began the project of me trying to write down not only the contemporaneous activism I was seeing among black women, but trying to take it and do a historical dive as an amateur historian, because I have no training. I didn't even know what a primary source was until I started working with the Sophia Smith collection, so I didn't know these things. But what I did know was that it was impossible, well, not possible, it was difficult to organize black women to support abortion rights when they didn't know their history, when they didn't know that they were part of a long chain of black women fighting for reproductive control and autonomy. This wasn't just starting in the 1980s. This wasn't just starting in the time that my job was to organize them. And that caused me to start looking at the sisters whose shoulders I was standing on. And of course, once I started unearthing that material, I had the joy of being sent a manuscript by Jessie Rodriguez, who wrote extensively on the history of black women and birth control. And I remember reading this manuscript in like 1985 or 86 when Jessie sent me a draft of it, and I loved it except for one thing. I wanted the history of abortion too. I didn't just want it to stop at birth control. And so that's when I imagined that I could extend her work and talk about the history of black women and abortion. While she did a great job covering birth control, I wanted to take it a step further. And so in my hubris, I thought I could do that. I've been working on black abortion since 1989. Still ain't out. It is the longest pregnancy in the world. This book that I want to birth. Since then, though, thankfully, all the weight's not on my shoulders. I was leapt for joy when Dorothy Roberts wrote Killing the Black Body in 1994, and I was like, oh my God, she wrote the book I wanted to write. Go Dorothy, go Dorothy, go Dorothy. Since then, I've been joined by a legion of black women who are now writing on reproductive politics, not the least of which is Cynthia Greenlee, who is doing amazing work researching African American doctors who provided abortion services and stuff. And so we're now seeing a real uptick in people doing this research, which brings us back to Margaret Sanger, because one of the things that I encountered when I first started writing on black women and abortion was, of course, the history and knowledge of the Negro Project that Sanger started in 1939. And then there were all kinds of interpretations of that project. Some people thought it was a genocide plot. Some people thought it was a project bringing very much needed services into an underserved community. At the same time, Sanger was either vilified or worshipped, depending on who you talk to. There was this total interesting spin put on her by Planned Parenthood, which basically said, that was then, this is now, she doesn't represent us now, you know, kind of like a ambivalent kind of thing, a disowning of their own founder. And I was like, that's very interesting. But then the anti-abortion movement was willing to demonize her and say that she was the architect of genocide in the black community and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you know, as a black person, I tend to remember things like the enslavement and the Ku Klux Klan threatening us. I do not remember a particular white woman leading a crusade to wipe us out. How did I miss that in all my black history classes? Kind of thing. And so I was left with either a whitewash, a silence, or a vilification. And I could not figure out which one I wanted to include or authenticate in my research. So fortunately, by that time, I'd gotten to that part in the research, and I started a relationship with Joyce Fillet and Cheryl Redmond and the Sophia Smith collection, which of course has the records of Planned Parenthood. And so that afforded me the opportunity to actually go to now primary sources that I learned about and things, and make up my mind for myself. Now, I have not come up with any definitive thing around Margaret Sanger. I'm not sure if the records or the evidence will ever give us that. But I'm saying that she is a far more complicated person than people have allowed on either side. Because I can see that from the records she left, the evidence she left, Florence Rose's records, on, as well as the things she wrote in her own words. The other thing that I found out in trying to piece together a narrative, a black feminist narrative of Margaret Sanger, is that people who do big things historically often make big mistakes too. I mean, we could go through, we got to get away from this angel-devil theory of great people who do only great things and bad people who only do bad things. I mean, that's just such an unsophisticated analysis. And the other thing that concerns me is using the perfect vision, 2020 vision, on the past. Because what we judge people by today is not what people were judged by in the past. And so, by the terms of her era, Margaret Sanger, in my opinion, was not a racist. But by today's terms, she is. So it's a question of what criteria are you using? Are you using the context in which she was embedded, or are you applying modern things to it, modern judgments to it? I actually call her an accidental intersectionalist because at the same time, of course, she was engaged with the eugenics movement, first got engaged with them and then disengaged with them, that kind of thing. She also was speaking out against racism. At a time, very few white people were speaking out against racism. So she was very much ahead of the curve, talking about, and the reason I say intersectional, because she was talking about poverty and white supremacy and discrimination as being a problem for black people to become self-determining. She was naming these kinds of issues long before most people listened to the civil rights movement and learned to name these things, particularly most white people listening to it. So she was very much ahead of her time, so that's why I call her the accidental intersectionalist. She probably didn't realize the power of naming the abject conditions under which people had to make their reproductive decisions in. But that's what reproductive justice does. The framework that we created in 1994, it talks about the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent your children, but it particularly pays attention to the conditions under which reproductive decision making takes place. Because if you don't pay attention to those conditions, you really don't understand how people make their decisions and what are the consequences of those decisions. And we who created reproductive justice have always criticized both the pro-choice and the pro-life movement for starting at the wrong place, and that is with the pregnancy. when in fact you need to start with what's going on in the person's life long before they even know that they're pregnant. If you don't pay attention to those human rights violations, the lack of health care, the lack of adequate housing, gentrification, state violence, immigration restrictions, all the things that we've wrapped up into reproductive justice, then you have no idea what's really going on in that person's life when you're trying to put both a pro-life or a pro-choice analysis to that person's life. So she in many ways presaged what we were saying with reproductive justice. Now, the other thing that complicates any black feminist analysis of Margaret Sanger is the fact that we are up against people who are opposed to women's human rights and women's rights to control what happens to our bodies, and who do not see abortion as the human right that we see it as. And so one of the things that complicates things is that we do not want to load bullets in the guns of the anti-abortion movement attacking Margaret Sanger. So it's very hard to offer a tempered critique even of her without feeding the people who do not care about us or our lives and stuff. And so that in my mind somewhat mutes the nuance that we'd like to offer, because we have to constantly resist the attempts by people who are against women's human rights to repeal the entire 20th century and act like it never happened. And so this places us in a terrible position, an invidious position, when it comes to, well, how do we offer a black feminist analysis of Margaret Sanger that speaks the truth to the white supremacist context in which she was embedded, and offers a critique of the eugenics movement, but at the same time appreciates and lauds the immeasurable contribution she made in pushing forth the legalization of birth control. I mean, that has changed the world. There's no arguing that. You know, nobody, I don't know, in history has had that much impact on women's lives as Margaret Sanger has had, in a very positive and powerful way, even as we problematized how she did it. So we're in that position. Of course, I want to switch to talking about black feminist theory, because I wanted to maybe bring into conversation concepts that we are always, as black feminists, using, but we're also always in the process of educating the larger women's movement about our concepts. I think it all started with Combahee River Collective in 1977 defining identity politics. And then, of course, Kim Crenshaw came up in 1989 and defined intersectionality. And then in 1994, we redefined reproductive justice. So we're always embodying a radically different analysis in many ways that then ripples out and people adapt and use for their own benefit, which is what it's supposed to do, actually. I mean, I think black feminist theory is a generous theory. We offer this stuff to the universe and then often find ourselves neglected when lack of attribution happens. Like it just came out of the ether. You know, it just didn't, you know. But anyway, I ain't gonna talk about my feelings. Let me stay on black feminist theory. Obviously, intersectionality is a cornerstone of black feminist theory, and that has probably migrated the most globally in terms of how people understand how people simultaneously occupy many different lived experiences. The way that it is intended is to be used to analyze what your vulnerabilities are. The way it gets distorted is when people start talking about simply their attributes. Like, okay, I'm of Scottish heritage and I'm a bagpipe singer, and that makes my intersectional identity unique from yours because, excuse me, how does that make you vulnerable? Is the question. So people are using their identities in an additive way instead of an integrative way and stuff to expose vulnerability. So this is something that we kind of push on and say intersectionality is not just your resume, your identity resume. It's supposed to be about what human rights violations you're at risk of experiencing and how we need to attend to those violations so that you enjoy the same human rights that everybody else has who doesn't have those vulnerabilities. And my best way of explaining that is like saying every child has a right to an education, but a blind child might read her books in Braille. She doesn't have special rights. She has special vulnerabilities that have to be attended to so that she can enjoy the same educational human rights as a sighted child. So you can just grow from that and say every human being has their own vulnerabilities. Some of my vulnerability might have been my parents didn't go to college, so they didn't know how to send a child to college. You know, another vulnerability is that I live on a mountain in Shrewsbury that doesn't have great cell or internet service. I never thought I'd move to Pioneer Valley and be on the other side of the digital divide, but I am. You know? And if you're not digitally connected nowadays, you're like feeling subhuman. You know, even though you're not actually, but it does feel that way when you can't even make a phone call and stuff. But anyway, moving right on. The other thing that black feminist theory insists upon is that theory does not have to be abstract. That we do not believe that actually the best theory comes from abstraction. We think the best theory comes from lived experiences. And people who are able to theorize from the body of living that they've done have offered in many ways the most transformative theory in the world. But it often gets discredited because it doesn't come from the hallowed halls of the academy and stuff. And so, but we talk about how important it is to marry the lived theory with the more academic theory in order to get a fuller picture. I want to stop and say, one of the problems of black feminist theory is that people go too far the other way. So they think that their lived experiences is all they need to know in order to provide analysis. Now, just because you experienced it doesn't make you an expert on it. You're an expert on your life, maybe, but a black person, by definition, is not an expert on white supremacy. You have to read, you have to learn, you have to do it, even though they've experienced white supremacy all their lives, and kind of stuff. So we also push back on people taking the feelings, lived experiences too far, too. It's like, yeah, that's not how it's done. It's the marriage of knowledge and lived experiences that we push in black feminist theory. One of the other things, I could go on, I've got a whole list of black feminist theory, but I've got a limited amount of time, so I'm going to select from it. One of the other things that black feminist theory does is resist the individualist analysis, the analysis of individualism that, you know, said most simply, just because Oprah's made it doesn't mean most black women have and will, kind of thing. We actually prefer older, pre-colonial, pre-European philosophical traditions that talk about collectivity and interdependence and other ways human beings can be together, rather than the atomistic, competitive, enlightenment-based liberalism that justifies plunder capitalism. And so we are much more in tune with pre-European philosophical traditions in many ways. The one that I'm most fond of is Ubuntu, which I did not hear until I learned about until I was part of the anti-apartheid movement. I did not know that there was a whole African-based philosophy that should have been available to us the same way Kant was, but no. Anyway, moving right along. I think the last thing I'll say about black feminist theory, because I want to close with black women's engagement with sexual and reproductive politics, is that we are deeply critical as Black feminists of symbolic inclusion versus substantive change. I think it's Black feminists that are really quick to talk about, oh, you want to tokenize us, you want to do this thing to make yourself feel good, but you don't want to actually do any transformative work around decentering the people of privilege so that you can create a more inclusive frame for everybody. And so you'll see that kind of conversation take place quite a bit within the Black feminist tradition and the Black feminist theory. And I think one of the privileges that we have is our insider-outsider standpoint, that we also have to build bridges between our NATO communities from which we come and the communities in which we do our work, like the feminist movement, like the anti-capitalist movement or the anti-imperialist movement, on and on. We have to build bridges, sometimes serving as translators, bridge builders, and all these kinds of things, and in a way that pushes us to develop new ways of knowing and new ways of seeing the world because of that dual standpoint that we have to maintain for our survival's sake. So in closing, let me talk about Black women's engagement with sexual and reproductive politics. One of the things that my research and others has always revealed is Black women were never, ever unconscious about their role in reproduction and the building of wealth in America. We were brought over here as chattel slaves. And we were impregnated through multi-generational rapes so that we could make another group of people wealthy. So long before white women were conscious about their role in populating America, we were very conscious of that. And that is an atavistic, multi-generational perspective that we've always brought to the discussion of reproductive and sexual politics. Whether or not it was documented or known and all of that, that's a separate question. That's an artifact of, whose knowledge matters and gets documented, not whether or not it existed in the first place. In my research on African American women and abortion and birth control, I found out that Black women bought knowledge of how to perform abortions and practice birth control even as enslaved people. They bought it from Africa and they adapted it to the United States. And well, I could say the New World, the whole Western world. I just recently received a book called The Secret Cures of Slaves that talked about all the medical practices that the enslaved people used that were largely unknown to the Europeans. And the only time the Europeans even noticed something was happening was when entire plantations of women failed to reproduce. And so they would invite doctors in to examine the women to see if they were massively infertile, never ascribing to them any agency in controlling their own reproduction. So this is a conversation that has been going on in the enslaved African American community from the moment of the enslavement. And then you also, in the period following the Civil War, after the forced breeding of the enslavement, we witnessed the African American birth rate cut in half. In 50 years, the birth rate was cut in half. And it wasn't because Black people were having less sex, trust me. I think this was Black women asserting their own sexual agency and trying to do the best they could in determining how many children they had and the conditions under which they would have those children. I discovered an 1892 statement, I think it was from Anna Julia Cooper, who was talking about the right of Black women to determine for themselves whether or not motherhood was for them, kind of things. And this was before Margaret Sanger. Need I point this out? And of course, just in closing, I'm going to talk about, because of this strong commitment, which was also complicated by the growing religiosity of Christianity in the Black community, we ended up with a largely unmarked, largely unnoticed, but actually palpable relationship to managing reproduction. So that you ended up with a large number of black doctors willing to perform abortions, but trying to do so under the radar and under the notice of the authorities. But so much so that white women started coming to black doctors for abortions that they could not get from their own doctors. And the black doctor would charge them more money so that they could subsidize the abortions that they were providing for the black women. So you find this kind of evidence, and one of the best places for evidence on this on this subject was in the black newspapers of the 1930s and the 1940s, where they were actually campaigns in support of the black doctors who were being prosecuted and persecuted. So there was this strong pro-agency, pro-women's rights sentiment in the black community and amongst the leading black civil rights organizations at the time that did not get deeply complicated until the 1970s, when the black nationalist, black power movement came about, which reverted to a pro-natalist stance around having babies to try to overwhelm white supremacy by the outbreed, or what a Sanger called the cradle competition, took over the black power movement. And then that's when a whole nother conversation started happening around black women and reproductive politics, led in no small part by Shirley Chisholm, who became the first black president of NARAL, and really wanted to say, we have the right to determine what goes on in our bodies, and we do not have to have a baby for the revolution and throw away our birth control pills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I will end there because I'd like some respondents to come up. But I hope to finally finish black abortion within the next decade. I keep promising a deadline for this book. I've got like tons and tons of files and more research. But I will say, what's making it so hard is that I have to read the accounts of black history with the gender lens. I have to read the accounts of women's history with the racial lens. And then even when people write black women's history, I have to read it with the reproductive justice lens. Because these silences are in all of those places. And so I'm having to piece together and in many ways interpret what these silences mean. And it's pretty presumptuous to interpret a silence, but this is what people have been doing for years, so I think I got as much right to do that as anybody else. But just interpret stuff when when somebody says, "End your calendar worries," in a newspaper ad. Well, when's the one time a woman is worried about the dang calendar? When something is missing. Yeah. And so that's the kind of interpretive work that's making my job and my passion so difficult, that I'm having to read 3 different bodies of historical work for finding that thing called, and what did they do about reproduction? And I will shut up one last anecdote. I was listening to a scholar give me a wonderful presentation on the first group of black nurses who were sent to the Philippines and to Cuba because the white nurses didn't want to deal with the black soldiers at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, 1898 and what have you. And so after the scholar did this presentation, I asked, well, what do they do about birth control and reproduction? Because anytime you put fertile adult people together, that's an issue. And the scholar looked at me and said, I didn't ask that question. That's what we have to do. Thank you.
And I will try to keep my remarks within reasonable limits. I may, it was so many things, wonderful things that Loretta said that I want to refer back to, so we will see how it goes. Loretta Ross, as she did not say, is of course the latest in a string of remarkable black women who, from the early 19th century, as she alluded to, addressed the interplay of racist, sexist, and classist oppression. Women who underscored how multiple forms of exclusion and discrimination shaped women's reproductive experience. And she has indeed, as Carrie mentioned, popularized the vibrant term reproductive justice as basic to a broader social justice mission. Ever since I read her co-authored volume, Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, I have been a fan of Loretta's, and I have followed many of her talks, and she is, as you can all tell, a delight to listen to her speak. And Joyce Valet, who will be speaking shortly too, another champion of reproductive justice, has applied the theory and practice in her oral histories and path-breaking documentaries on women of color, especially the much ignored Native American women, for which I'm very grateful. Before I get started, I do want to say I pulled out of my file, just very quickly, something from the Margaret Sanger Papers Project called Nervous Laughter. It includes some very lighthearted and charming cartoons. And I'm going to pass this around. And I should also mention the caption under the top of this particular issue of the newsletter. There are many that Smith College's Sophia Smith collection, in addition to the New York University Margaret Sanger's project, they collaborated in thousands of microfilm digitizing all kinds of letters from 1,500 or so archives. Anyway, the caption says, "No woman can be free who does not own and control her body." And in more recent years, Linda Gordon coined the term from a French leader, the moral property of women. And so with that still as a basic understanding, I will proceed and enjoy the cartoons. I just want to get this issue, though, back before I leave today. As we examine the relationship between reproductive justice and Margaret Sanger, let us consider a few facts. Progress in women's struggle to control their bodies took many, many years and still goes on. Many still do not uphold Sanger's dictum that I quoted. Contraceptives for all married women were prohibited in this state until 1965, the year before Sanger died, thanks to a Supreme Court decision in Griswold versus Connecticut. Contraceptives for single women, many of you here are single women, unwed, were prohibited in Massachusetts until 1972 in Baird versus Eisenstadt Supreme Court case, when a majority, but not all the judges, a majority ruled that unwed women could have access to contraceptives. It was that case that paved the way for Roe v. Wade the following year, and this is in the lifespan of your mothers and grandmothers. Similarly, reproductive justice, as Loretta has eloquently said, requires that women can choose to have a child as well as not. And we know of all the recent attacks on women nursing their babies in public, but jobs are also at stake. A few years ago, UPS discriminated against a pregnant woman. And although the pre-Gorsuch court majority ruled in Young versus UPS that such discrimination was against the Civil Rights Act, the new court might not so rule. Legislatures have lagged behind the Supreme Court because of an all-encompassing fear. Fear of female freedom and their equal opportunity and rewards in the workforce. Fear that rises from a deeper fear of the loss of male dominance and privilege at home and in the public sphere, a fear that family roles, family systems will fall apart if women are not the primary caretakers of children, men, and the elderly. This fear shapes the right wing of religious organizations, educational institutions, and the media. As Loretta mentioned, health care is critical to women's reproductive lives. We know that today, and more severely in the past, Black women's access to health care was and is far more limited by all sorts of medical costs and child rearing costs, all still soaring, and often racist exclusion from hospital care. Health remains a pivotal issue today, with the maternity rate today among Black women 1/3 higher than among white women. Of course, there are those more affluent Black women for whom the hefty costs are not insuperable. I think of Michelle Obama, her 2 daughters, who are the result of very costly in vitro fertilization. Social economic class is part of that complex of intersecting realities, and in her case, she was a chooser rather than, as Ricky Solinger so aptly titled her superb book, a beggar. She had Beggars and Choosers as the title. My focus today is on the decades between the 2 world wars, when Margaret Sanger faced immense opposition in her fight for women's reproductive rights. We need to understand, as Loretta pointed to, a historical context here. Unlike most white women, black women, and this is part of the positive part of the story, black women, thank goodness, long understanding the dynamics of real reproductive choice in their lives, led efforts for reproductive justice. During the 1920s, when Sanger lacked a strong white base of supporters, most black churches supported women's reproductive freedom. This is something Jessie Rodriguez ably shows, even provided space in their churches for women to gain access to both sex education and contraceptives. But Sanger faced ferocious white clerical opposition. For example, one of the most forceful anti-abortion and anti-contraception statements was expressed in 1921 by Archbishop Hayes of New York. Quote, "To take life after its inception is a horrible crime, but to prevent human life is satanic." That outlook still prevails among the majority of Catholic clergy, as well as in fundamentalist Protestant communities. Whereas Sanger also faced a white hostile press, as we heard, the black press in the 1920s, already well before the 1930s, because they suffered an incredible agricultural depression in the South in the 20s, then of course the general depression in the 30s, for the most part readily endorsed contraceptives. You can see their endorsement in editorials, you can see it in advertisements for contraceptives. The white press totally failed to support Sanger. So black women organized separately until the 1930s, wholly independent of white reproductive rights movements and of Margaret Sanger. And later, black branches of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America sustained a vital independence from the dubious white-run organization, national organization, the national PPFA, had to appease to stay alive, to survive its wealthy, white, often racist donors and members. Typifying historic black female agency and commitment to reproductive justice, the classic statement of the black feminist Combahee River Collective in 1977 that Loretta alluded to, coupled women's right to choose to have a child or not in their campaign for both abortion rights and an end to sterilization abuse. They focus as well on the toll of capitalism in depriving less privileged women of all races from access to high-quality health care. The year before the Combahee River Collective statement, after a decade of black women's campaigning, CARAS formed, the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization. This committee and many of those following stand on the shoulders, indeed, of countless African-American precursors. Not only did Sanger face hostile clergy, hostile press, hostile political parties if she wanted to decriminalize contraception, she lived in a time that was profoundly pronatalist. American capitalism, imperialism, and nationalism rested on an expanding population of future warriors and workers. Although pronatalist rhetoric was aimed at white women primarily, many whites recognized the need for black women to keep breeding cheap household labor and cheap agricultural and industrial labor. President Teddy Roosevelt spoke for many when he stated, quote, "Exactly as the measure of our regard for the soldier who does his full duty in battle is the measure of our scorn for the coward who flees, so too the measure of our respect for the true wife and mother is the measure of our scorn and contemptuous abhorrence for the wife who refuses to be a mother." Unquote. Of course, Roosevelt's premier concern was white Anglo-Saxon race suicide and his eugenics beliefs. And bringing this topic of eugenics close to home to you here at Smith, in 1928, professor of sociology David Hankins proposed to a senior sociology class here to undertake a project to identify, quote unquote, defective humans in Shutesbury, Leverett, and other small towns of western Massachusetts. Hankins believed that the sterilization of degenerates was a humane, progressive policy. The Supreme Court had already endorsed that in an earlier decision. Though the Smith College students who worked on his project never published their own research, the journal Eugenics in 1929 printed a summary of the research, authored by Constantine Ladis, the only male who was hired to work on the project. Attacks on Sanger from the political left were as ferocious as those from the right. Political radicals and labor leaders restricted women's entry into trade unions and believed they belonged home as submissive wives supporting the egos of their capitalists and battered husbands. For them, birth control was at best a band-aid and at worst a threat to male supremacy and to securing legislation to mitigate poverty and unemployment. Sanger simply could not count on the left, nor could she count on feminists. That's too long a story right now to tell, but I have written about it. Her political base was limited, but her support from millions of women in letters to her was vibrant. As Loretta signals, one needs a bifocal lens, historian Suzanne Lebsock's term, by the way, when we look at historical figures, including ourselves. With one lens, we look at the historical context, its myriad pressures, its sticks and carrots, its complex forces behind decision-making. With the other lens, we look retrospectively from our present. Depending upon the we balance or try to balance our current values with what was possible then, and the sense of what was possible is constantly a subject of historical controversy. So to interpret, empathize with, assess Margaret Sanger, as Loretta points out, epitomizes this tension. Politics is the art of the possible, and Sanger was adroit in figuring out what tactics might work, adjusting her words to her specific audience, sometimes sounding quite racist and eugenicist, other times harshly criticizing racism and eugenics. For example, she insisted that, quote, intelligence and other inherited traits vary by individual, not by group, unquote. We can cherry pick Sanger's speeches and writings to serve both sides of the eugenics and race issues. Sanger's support of the doctors only bill, I could talk about that later, is another example of where she sought a compromise between, and a pragmatic compromise between, trying to get support for contraception at the same time that she's abandoning the notion that women of any class can have access to abortion. So it is in the face of this dominant national outlook among whites that we must view Sanger's fundraising and politics and her legacy. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie, for organizing this, and everyone else for coming. I want to acknowledge this is a thrill to be here with everyone, but especially with Joyce and Loretta. Joyce taught me my first women's history class 40-some years ago. At the time, there was one semester class covering the history of all women at University of Massachusetts. That was the end of it. That's all there was at the time. And Joyce taught it and sent me on my way. And Loretta has more recently been an essential part of my work and an inspiration to take that historical work and put it to good use in the real world to strengthen social movements. So this is really sweet. I want to focus my remarks on the link between the status of reproductive politics today and the work of historical research and analysis that Loretta and Joyce have been engaged in. Given the urgencies of reproductive politics, we might be accused of dancing on the head of a pin by trying to determine whether Margaret Sanger, who's been gone for more than a half century, was a racist or a liberator of women. But in fact, the characterization of Sanger is of real significance to reproductive politics today, and it's of significance because the opponents of sexual and reproductive freedom rely so heavily on the characterization of Sanger as a eugenicist. For example, they invoke this characterization to claim that rates of abortion are disproportionately high in the black community and other communities of color because these communities, they say, are being targeted by an abortion movement that may present as a health service, but that is actually a racist, perhaps even a genocidal project. And they they attempt to advance a historical argument that presents abortion as only the current day manifestation of the racism that is endemic in American society, and draw a direct line between enslavement and lynching and eugenics and abortion. So, and Sanger becomes the main villain in this plot. So she's someone to contend with. And we see this argument about the historical trajectory of slavery to lynching, to eugenics, to abortion. It appears in Supreme Court, the chambers of the Supreme Court very recently, in Clarence Thomas's recent very lengthy opinion in the Box versus Planned Parenthood case. He elaborates extensively on this argument, features Sanger. And the argument appears in popular culture as well. So I just want to show a couple of examples of this. I say in advance, these are not all pleasant images, but examples of this effort to popularize the notion of Sanger as a eugenicist and therefore abortion as a racist project. There are efforts to associate abortion with slavery. The inhumanity of slavery has been replaced by the inhumanity of abortion. Connections to lynching, that lynching is for amateurs as compared to the phenomenon of abortion. And here we see the play on words with Planned Parenthood, obviously a reference to Planned Parenthood, and an effort to invoke Sanger as the champion of birth control and a founder of Planned Parenthood, who was thereby implicated in this connection. There are many, many examples of this, but moving very quickly ahead to the civil rights movement here in a very familiar setting of the National Mall, looking out from the from the Lincoln Memorial, from the perspective that Martin Luther King would have had as he delivered his I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Here's the accusation that essentially that black women who have been apparently duped by Sanger and her ilk into having abortions have turned their backs on that kind of a dream. And there's a more recent example from the 1910-1911 anti-abortion campaign.
2010.
Pardon me?
2010.
What did I say, 19?
Yeah.
Thank you. 2010 campaign, just as the right wing was gaining a lot of political power and really unleashed its fury on movements for sexual and reproductive rights, something that Loretta was very immersed in. And to the extent that this argument gains traction, it has benefited from our lack of historical knowledge. So, for example, we do not yet have the kind of full-blown Margaret Sanger, full-bodied, complicated human being who was an activist for more than 50 years. We don't have a general popular appreciation for the complexity of her as a person and as an activist, which allows this more simplistic version of her to carry the day. But I want to suggest that we do have abundant evidence to create that. Joyce and Loretta and others are building that kind of a robust profile. And there's here's another example. They go on into the Black Lives Matter movement. It's right up to they're very current with this effort to continue to associate, make these connections. But we do have abundant evidence of Sanger, and this is just one example, one document out of, I don't know, tens of thousands of documents that sit here on the campus of Smith College at the Sophia Smith Collection. And one example of Sanger's own notes. She's writing notes in preparation for a funding proposal to Albert Lasker, who will fund her her effort to make birth control available in the black community in the late 1930s and early 40s. So we have an example of some of the intricacies and details of her own thinking, her own beliefs, and her own strategies, frankly, in trying to get funding for this project. And she goes on for a couple of pages here. So we do have the evidence to flesh out this human being in all her complexity. The other lack of historical knowledge that we suffer from is the lack of rich histories of women of color who are allegedly being duped by Sanger and the likes of Sanger into having abortions. But how are they actually negotiating the economic, the sexual, domestic violence, economic conditions in making decisions about controlling their bodies and having or not having children? And by focusing so narrowly on Sanger, by shining a bright light on Sanger and characterizing her as the villain in this unrelenting story of racial terror that comes to bear on the bodies of women of color, this ends up casting the women of color as villains, being oppressed by her rather than as agents in their own lives. It pushes women of color to the shadows. And until recently, we really haven't had the kind of histories that would spell out the truths of those lives. We are beginning to see that scholarship emerge, and we hope it will find its way into the movements. But we do, again, evidence of this kind of organizing, and Joyce referred to it as well. This is a newspaper article in the New York Amsterdam News. I think it was 1920 something, an organization of black club women that is organizing in favor of birth control and is about to invite Sanger to speak to them. Mary McLeod Bethune, a prominent black leader in the early 20th century. She is the leader of the National Council of Negro Women, and this is a memo from 1941 that contains the resolution of the Black Women's Club movement in favor of promoting birth control in the black community, long before national white women's organizations would take that stand. Another example, Dorothy Farabee is sitting in the chair here. She's a black physician who every summer in the late 1930s and early 40s would take a group of other black women, nurses, and medical providers to the plantations of Mississippi, where they would set up mobile clinics and provide health care, including contraceptive information and services, to the women who worked in the fields. These women, and I've only sampled a couple of them, these are contemporaries of Sanger. and they're all organizing for birth control and reproductive health at the same time. Sometimes, most often, they're working separately, but in fact, there were often actual formal collaborations between these black women and Sanger. Several of these women sat on the board of the Division of Negro Service, which Sanger organized to promote the dissemination of birth control in the black community. This is not to say that those relations were always smooth. They were not. They were fraught. And black women, more often than not, would call Sanger out on her shortcomings for not fully appreciating black women as equal in leadership and decision-making capacities. But it was a relationship, and this is I think black women might call Sanger, of that era, might call Sanger, in today's parlance, a problematic ally. But that's the nitty-gritty, messy truth of what the social movement for reproductive rights and health looks like at that time, and we would benefit from knowing the details. I also want to say that these women were contemporaries of Sanger, and they are also Loretta's direct foremothers. Dorothy Farabee, sitting in the chair here, and this is, I want to say, is 1940, 1941. In 1969 or 70, Dorothy Farabee, who teaches OBGYN at Howard Medical School, also sits on the DC Commission on the Status of Women, 69-70, at the time when the District of Columbia is considering legalizing abortion well in advance of...
They did it in 1970.
In 1970, in advance of Roe versus Wade, as did a couple of other states. And also sitting at that table at the DC Commission on the Status of Women was a young upstart named Loretta Ross. This is one of those moments where Loretta is really a transitional figure between multiple generations of black women who have been struggling, as Loretta says, from the beginning of their arrival in this country to control their own bodies. But as Fannie Lou Hamer put it, our bodies have never been ours alone. But Farabee, at the time in 1970, spoke up around the issue of legalizing abortion in DC and said, if it's going to be legal, we need to make sure that it is legal and accessible for black women as well. So this is a kind of a long story, and my point is that as long as we have only a one-dimensional cardboard cutout kind of understanding of Margaret Sanger, as long as we look to individual larger-than-life figures rather than to grassroots social movements for the sources of social change, and as long as we have a very limited understanding of the actual lived experiences of, in this case, black women and other women of color, low-income women, queer individuals, as they have struggled for bodily autonomy, then Loretta and the other movement leaders of our own time will remain at a disadvantage as they come up against the forces that will continue to promote distorted historical narratives to advance their own ends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the three of us should come up here now.
Yeah, could you all come up?
This is rich. Particularly when you get told your own history by a historian and didn't even know that you didn't even, I didn't even know that.
What?
The old, I'll talk about it. When I was first on the DC Commission for Women, I didn't know how important those women were. I just knew I was the mouthy baby dread.
So, can you moderate
Yeah.
the question?
So we've given you a lot of information, and I'm sure that it has sparked some conversation, some dissension, probably, and some inquiries on what else we could talk about. So I want to open the floor for questions. I want to limit the comments, though, because I want to have time to get more questions in as opposed to statements or comments or things like that. So anybody got questions for us? Now you knew this moment was coming.
Maybe this is the one question, but there's an abortion fund here in the area.
Yes.
I know that people were tabling at the Women's March in Springfield, but, and I wanted to send the money, but when I looked on the site, it didn't look like it was active anymore.
Let me just say, I'm the president of the Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts, just by coincidence, and we would love your money. Yeah.
I saw last posting was in 2017 on the website, so I thought it wasn't that.
I'll get you the information.
And they're having an event on March 28th at the Red Barn that I'm speaking at. So come and support them on the 28th at 4 o'clock. March 28th at 4 o'clock.
Yes.
Anybody else?
Here's some.
In Carrie's class a couple days ago, we were talking about disability, and later that night I watched a Vice video about how Down syndrome and prenatal screening seems to be the new eugenics conversation surrounding abortion. I was wondering if you all could speak a little bit to that and the way that the conversations to limit abortions have changed.
There is an issue in Signs, the primary journal in women's studies, it's been around for a while, that came out about, I'm going to just think around 8 years ago, totally focused on the kind of question you're asking, showing how current policies with regard medical, physician policies, laws, and other things are creating a neo-eugenics situation. That's one example with regard to sort of doctors with vulnerable women saying, don't give birth to a child with Downs. You don't want to do that. You don't want to handicap yourself. Disregarding what the woman herself might actually be willing to do and want to do. And the same thing is true in a number of other types of areas of that has to do with in vitro fertilization and egg collecting and everything, about decisions being made in semen banks, is the only way to put it, about who should be giving birth and who should not be giving birth. That gets back to the whole reproductive justice issue of women's freedom to choose to have babies or not. And I'm glad you raised that.
And the only thing I would like to add is that in our conversations on the intersection between disability justice and reproductive justice is we call attention to the lack of social supports for people to parent children with different abilities. I mean, that is the real driver, because many people would continue pregnancies if they were seen as problem pregnancies if they could get some assurance that they were going to be supported in their parenting decision. As a matter of fact, the fact that we individualize the responsibility for dealing with differently abled children actually is eugenics, in my opinion,
Yes.
because that then leaves the whole responsibility for raising differently abled children on the individual family without adequate supports from society and stuff. My younger sister is 13 months younger than me, is severely disabled. She's still with us and was born with severe disabilities, and so I was raised with my mother devoting her entire emotional life to keeping my baby sister alive. And so I saw the toll that it took on my family And so I don't offer an opinion about people choosing or not to make that choice for themselves, because when you've lived that experience, you know what's missing in terms of social support.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in, so I really want to hear more ideas. I really want to hear ideas about what are some ways people can begin to make raising children who are disabled easier on families. I know there's like a few radical childcare collectives, like I actually belong to one that offer childcare for union meetings, but I haven't seen anything about how the community can get involved with supporting families who have disabled children. Like, I mean, I have autism, and my best friend had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and like, we're functioning adults, we learn how to deal with disability despite not having parental support, but like, it's kind of like, how can we take that knowledge and help parents who are raising these kids, like, have that knowledge, and also have parents who are trying to, if they can kind of have a child with disabilities, like, know they have what option they actually have. Sorry.
I think, again, autism, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be psychological, be any kind of disability. We don't have, as Lourdes said, the support systems for many families, unless they're very rich, and even then, no matter how affluent, there still has to be an agency with caring individuals who will assist. We don't have that infrastructure. Canada's a little better, by the way, on this, just to mention, and part of it I can't help but feel has to do with a more generous and enlightened health system in Canada than we have in the United States. I mean, we're facing an incredibly stingy and individualistic, to get back to that, view of life that prevails in this country, which is very sad.
Yeah, I'm wondering how can get those systems, like, are there way people, I'm wondering if people who are in the grassroots can help create those systems, or is it not even like something that's feasible? Like, I'm like, I mean, I don't know if people are making a choice either way, but I'm just wondering, like, how can people who are active begin to create that?
Well, I would actually say that I would like to see more exploration of how parenting takes place in the non-nuclear family mode, because there, the whole concept of other mothers and collectively parenting your community is something that got the enslaved black community through real times of tribulation and trouble and stuff like that, which is why we didn't have the same stigma attached to, unwed mothers and all this other stuff. There's just a whole different culture of co-parenting in non-European communities that is largely unexplored. But I think it could help us inform what we need now to get out of that atomized, individualistic, martyr-based parenting that we are presently dealing with. Did you want to respond?
No, I'm just trying to think of good answers to your question of how people who are in that situation can really inform the creation of solutions.
As social justice people, we create what is needed when the government doesn't. And so I would continue to encourage you to do that work, because we can create those things we need, because often we have to, because no one else prioritizes our needs.
I think what we need is more bridging between social groups, causes. That is, there are many causes many organizations that work with people with disabilities. There are reproductive rights organizations. We need to bring those organizations together in common to, protest for movements. And maybe this is something you could start even at Smith. There might be some organizing that would bridge that difference here at Smith in terms of organizing.
I'd like to call on Marlene Freed, my co-author with Undivided Rights. You had a question, Marlene?
I was just going to say, I was going to connect what you were asking about providing of child care and the Abortion Rights Fund, which is an example of doing what the government should be, filling the gap that government doesn't fill. And I'm thinking about the child care thing. People can create child care collectives, but also demand that, at least in radical feminist political spaces, that child care be offered and be free. And that was, back in the day, sort of a given, but it is not a given anymore. And so that's one way to sort of institutionalize what you're talking about, as opposed to just hoping that people will spring up and do it.
I want to call on Kelly and then Carrie. I just want to put in one piece, though, that I think needs to be talked about, and that is the reproductive justice rights of people who are disabled. Their right to have kids, their right to parent and stuff like that. That is an under-discussed subject, as if it's verboten for someone who's differently able to even consider becoming a parent and stuff. And so that's something that we really, really need to talk about, the whole, particularly since we've got this trend for people who are disabled clashing with the capitalist notion of designer babies. You know, we have to have much more conversation on that.
My question was for all three of you about your research. I'm wondering if Sanger's story and her current charge, what that looks like in other communities of color. For example, the campaigns that you referred to, Joyce, do those show up referring to other women of color, or is this really a black-white story? Tell me what you know about Sanger's role, impact, legacy, and also currency with other groups of women of color. Just curious about that history.
The first Title X program funded clinic was in a Chicano neighborhood in Texas.
Okay.
In Corpus Christi, Texas. And then, Joyce, I think I read in your book about an Asian American woman, or was it your research, who petitioned Margaret Sanger to come to the Asian American community in San Francisco. And so other women of color have always as well worked on establishing their reproductive autonomy, but the research and the documentation is still way behind what is needed and stuff. So we get these fragments that are teasing us, and we're saying, but what happened? You know, with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the emphasis on not letting Asian or Chinese American women, but Asian women come into this country, but the ones who are here, how did they manage their reproduction? We need someone writing those books and answering those questions.
And in fact, the later years of Margaret Sanger, when she was an international advocate, going to India, going all over the world, and has not yet been studied. It's one of the big gaps in Sanger scholarship, coming to terms with her activities that were global and international.
It's also true that Sanger in the 30s, mid-late 30s, had really been kind of marginalized within what had become the PFA, and she had moved to Arizona, and she was developing birth control clinics with Chicano women in Tucson and Phoenix. So, does that answer?
Yeah, it does. It just seems like it's just part of the filling out of the story.
Yes.
Barbara Gurr has written her book on Native American women and reproductive politics. I mean, we're just at the beginning of a massive need for new scholarship on all of this stuff. We could create a golden age of knowledge if we could, you know, and so that's why I'm constantly talking to students who are working on their dissertations or their theses, like, we really need you to look at this if you want to make your mark in the world, because nobody's looked at this way before. And still there's a lot of repetition taking place in what I get often asked to give my opinion on. And I'm like, could you just tweak that a little bit and stop talking about whether or not black women like the pro-choice framework? I mean, can we just go a little bit further now?
So I think it's also important to keep in mind that this is all about an attack on Planned Parenthood. And by seeing Margaret Sanger as sort of the progenitor of Planned Parenthood, then you can attack Title X funding, which is public funding for contraception. You can attack abortion as a sort of racist ideology and approach. And then the other thing is the 2010 Billboard campaign came out right after the election of Obama. It was an attempt to try to divide the black community and have them vote against Democrats and against Obama. So, unsuccessful, but that was part of it. It was a wedge. It was very political. I wanted to ask you about Sanger's views around disability, because while I think that she actually had, as far as the African American community, some progressive, like the memo that you showed, she was trying to help the Black community. From my limited research on Sanger, she was pretty ableist and pretty much like, I'm very supportive of African Americans, but if you have some sort of like, if you're feeble-minded, which of course then becomes, that sort of represents a lot of things. Did she truly believe that, or was that a strategic, expedient thing?
It's hard to know, Carrie. The situation is she has stated that it's, to get back to, it's the economic, the conditions in Black families or any poor families, the white poor were also demonized similarly, just like this Hankins study. She argued in many places, if they had good nutrition, if they had proper health care, many of these, what are assumed to be innate to certain communities, would not be. That a lot of this is a reflection of, but you can find her ableist statements. And that reminds me of the initial questions. The problem is the pro-life movement has co-opted that. They say, we're concerned about people who have Downs. We're concerned with people with various kinds of physical disabilities. We're concerned. The pro-choice movement wants to get rid of them. They're not interested in them, and they have created a narrative in which Sanger and many of the others who are involved in reproductive rights and justice are somehow insensitive to the realities of mothers and fathers who want to raise children with difficulties. And it's very important that that false narrative is corrected and that the authority falls back on the woman's choice in the way that Loretta is talking, a choice that's made with the full material conditions of life that would make a choice real.
Yeah.
And if you do not have those material conditions, you will choose, and properly, I think in many cases, possibly to abort a child when you hear from early screening that it has Down syndrome, knowing that it has all the consequences of raising a child, what it'll do to the family, the living children, the husband, wife, so forth. In a family where that is not the material conditions of life, they have the privilege of raising. I have an absolutely wonderful child with Downs as a grandchild. I would hate to think that that child was not around. It was not living. He is so dear. He's so wonderful. He has so many capacities that, quote, abled children do not have. But my son and daughter-in-law had the means, and they were in Canada to boot, to be able to raise their child in the way they did. And that's the precondition we're all talking about. We have to make sure that the pro-life movement doesn't co-opt that issue.
What, if anything, is the current administration of Planned Parenthood saying about Margaret Sanger? And if the answer is little or nothing, do you think they should be?
I haven't made a particular study of it. I know when they had their 100th anniversary a couple of years ago, we tried to engage them in conversations about coming up with a more unified and uniform analysis of Sanger instead of us being all over the place. We're saying this and you're saying this and da-da-da-da-da. And we couldn't get any purchase on that conversation. I think because there's a lot of internalized guilt or white supremacy, I don't know what else to call it, where their own research, and I'm talking about PPFA, they've done a body of research that advises them to disown Sanger, which doesn't make sense to us. It's got, I mean, literally, I watched them back in the early 2000s come up with a multi-million-dollar campaign around she was then and this is now and she's not us anymore kind of thing. We're like, that is less than helpful. And that's kind of like, let's talk about the auto industry and not talk about Henry Ford because he was an anti-Semitic. I mean, what are we talking about here? You can't can't do that kind of historical revisionism and pass the laugh test.
One little tidbit on that.
Yes.
Sanger was one of the most advanced people in the 1930s, putting pressure on the government to bring German Jews to this country. And Jews were then considered a race, not an ethnicity by most people. She brought major doctors from Germany who had the knowledge around contraception that many doctors in our country, at least in the establishment, did not. And it wasn't only doctors, she was instrumental in bringing a lot of other Jewish refugees to this country. So I always put that in the context when the pro-life movement juxtaposes images of Hitler and images of Sanger next to each other. It's all Photoshop, has no reality. It's infuriating. And actually, and Loretta hasn't spoken to this, she recently got a vile attack on her from some group called Radiance.
Oh, the Radiance Foundation, yeah. They're old news.
This is 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And it was this event, actually.
This event, they saw the poster and they decided to launch into a tirade about, Loretta.
Well, I've gone to Klan rallies as the only black person. These are amateurs. Go ahead.
No, I just think, to answer Evan's question about Planned Parenthood and their stance, I mean, on their 100th anniversary, they put out a video, I think it was just on their website, a 20-minute something, about their first 100 years strong, I think it was called, and noticeably kind of avoiding Sanger. It was a real opportunity to engage the complexity of this issue and to show sensitivity around and to acknowledge shortcomings in their own history and really come to grapple with this. And they really dodged it, which of course just feeds the ability of the opponents to play the Sanger card. You play the Sanger card and progressives kind of recoil. Oh, guilt by association, and if you don't have the kind of evidence to, put forward a more nuanced answer, then you've just lost. You've just conceded. So, and when public funding for Planned Parenthood is at stake, that's big stuff, and it just leaves them really vulnerable. They're really foolish not to.
Yeah, there's a real problems around PPFA. They would not support Bill Baird. When the whole issue was, and he was in prison, and the Baird versus Eisenstadt was a huge Supreme Court case. They were frightened of his radicalism. They were frightened of civil disobedience, and they were frightened of losing their supporters. The money. And so PPFA has played it very safe to be respectable at all costs. But we have no choice but to support PPFA because they continue to be the ones we count on to provide the education, to provide the services, and it's just, the lives we live in, if we can't have the best, we have to settle for what is reasonably okay, better than nothing, surely, and they do rally people to reproductive rights and reproductive choice, so it's not simple.
And the one thing I'll say about that is that whenever they're under attack, the one thing they do is de-emphasize their abortion services as if they can hide them.
Yes.
And if that's not the number one reason that they're under attack. When a tsunami's coming at you, you can only surf that sucker by going forward. You can't walk fast enough to outrun it. It's just, we would like a different strategic response. Did you have your hand up?
Well, I just have one quick question about the 2010, the campaign you were talking about, and I'm trying to understand that in terms of the rise of white supremacists within the government now and how that all plays out with the attitude toward having, eliminating the right to abortion for women. It just kind of seems it's a little hard to there's things that are sort of playing against each other, and I can't quite get my
Well, I'd love to send you a report on it because I wrote a report on it extensively. But what happened in Obama got elected in November of 2008, was it? Yeah. And in December of that year, there was a meeting at St. Simon's Island in Georgia about how to defeat the Obama presidency. And one of the things that they did was decide to target black women as his most loyal voting bloc. Okay, and so they chose to fund this new thing called the Radiance Foundation to put these billboards around the country blaming and shaming black women for our reproductive choices. Now, of course, when the billboards flashed, we didn't know all of this detail, so it took all of our opposition research to find out all the details about where did this come from, how did these billboards appear in all of our community, and blah, blah, blah. But I've written a report on this. I'd be more than happy to send you, because we had to defeat not only the billboards, but some race and gender-based legislation in the Georgia legislature. And the reason that it's so dangerous isn't just the attack on the Democratic base, but the fact that they were legislating and mandatory instructions for doctors to inquire about the motives for women seeking abortion. Before, the only legitimate question a doctor should be able to ask you is, when's your last menstrual period? Because that's the only medically relevant question. So but they were mandating, writing into law, that the doctor has to inquire why you're seeking the abortion, and then if those reasons are against this legislation, then the doctor, by law, has to deny you the abortion or risk losing the license and stuff. And so this is why we said this is really dangerous stuff. This isn't just black and brown and Asian American women. This is writing into law interrogation of women's motives for seeking abortions. And once you start that, then it opens up the whole floodgates and stuff.
Last question.
So I was just wondering, this is really changing my perspective, and I want to know, advice on how to take up Margaret Sanger as a figure in the gender studies classroom. I have taught Dorothy Roberts' The Dark Side of Birth Control. Once it did have the kind of unintended effect of turning a student against Planned Parenthood, and so now I'm just sort of trying to reconsider my tactics in the classroom. So I'm just wondering about advice on approaching the legacy of Sanger in the classroom context.
Well, Joyce, I like the way you write about it, because the first person that I read on Sanger was Linda Gordon. And I watched how her perspective changed over time. Because she started out with a very negative impression of Sanger, and that got replicated and repeated on our side for many years. And it wasn't until further research was done that got nuanced. And Joyce has written extensively about that nuancing. Is that a new word?
Yeah, it's a good one.
But
complicating the story.
Yeah, complicating the story, but yeah. But again, it's those missing narratives, because we need more data on what was what was her relationship with Asian American women. We don't know, but there is somewhere. It is somewhere. I just don't know where it is and stuff. We've got to not assume the worst.
Right.
Simply because there's no evidence that something was different.
Right. How did you teach it in the classroom, Joyce?
That's pretty much like I do in the Compass article. That is, I can't help but feel this entire discussion resonates with what we're dealing right now with all the Democratic nominees. I'm sorry, I'm sure that is spinning in your head. Without taking a position, we have someone who is advocating for national health insurance, single payer. It's wonderful. We know that lots and lots of people are not ready to go there. And we're dealing with, we'll never get this through Congress unless the public wants this. And if the public doesn't want it, well then maybe Klobuchar and Buttigieg are closer to the ground and where people are in terms of some kind of mix of, that would be American style single payer rather than Canadian style single, and we're dealing with these pragmatics versus our values and ideals all the time, and so that I see, you just think about in your own life when you're trying to make a choice like this, which person, that person, do I do that, or is it unrealistic, is this utopian, or can I do this? And Sanger was dealing with this constantly. She met with so much hostility. It was everybody was against her. He said even the women's movement at the time was against her, with a few exceptions. And then when she put forth a doctors only bill as a way of hopefully bringing at least the AMA on board to get medical support, because how was she going to ever spread the idea without medical? Mary Ware Bennett, much more idealistically in Massachusetts, said, no, that excludes poor women. We need an open bill. We need everybody to be able to have access to contraception. A doctor's only bill is for the middle class and the wealthy. You know, how do you make those choices? You know, it's not, you know, a simple matter.
Well, on that complicated note, we want to thank our panelists. And thank all of you.
Thank you.